We're deep in the bullpen at this point. Deep in the bullpen. Coming up on the last 2 weeks, and we've had a good time, and it's been great. We've had some great folks come and lead us, and I'm glad to be able to offer my very, very small contribution here tonight. So during these Celebrating Anglicanism events, we've had great opportunities for a significant review of the history of Anglicanism worldwide. You know, Rob Sturdy gave us a good foundation in the era of the English Reformation that we can build upon. And then Bishop Lawrence came and walked us through how the four corners of Anglicanism have historically worked together to preserve this center, this church in the center. He also demonstrated how the rise of revisionism led to the erosion of the center because the four corners could no longer work together. And finally, last week, Bishop Breedlove reminded us that when we talk about the history of the church, we have to talk about this with two prongs, one of faith and one of order. And tonight, as I lead you through this talk on the renewal and expansion of Anglicanism in North America, I'm going to be building upon the foundations built by these two men. And I really wish that we could have this conversation without having to talk about the decline of the Episcopal Church, but I'm afraid that the expansion of Anglicanism in North America and the decline of the Episcopal Church kind of go hand in hand. They are definitely coterminous events. Now, any one of you could stand here and deliver a far more accurate recounting of the decline of the Episcopal Church than I could ever hope to deliver, because it's your lived history. You went through it. You were at General Convention. You were at the Austin Conventions. You had to live it. You will understand it and know it at a level that I could never know. It's operating at what people would call the level of tacit knowledge. You just know it because you've been in it and you've lived it. So there's no need for me to try to stand here and focus on the minutiae of what happened over the last few decades. So I'm going to paint with a very broad brush, which means that everything I say is going to lack scholarly nuance. So don't hold that against me. My main point in recounting this whole story is to point out that it was a loss of apostolic and biblical faith that preceded any of the structural changes that have so plagued the Episcopal Church and affected this diocese over the last few years. I believe Bishop Breedlove was correct last week when he said that the problem with faith preceded the problem with order. And so my approach tonight is going to be to explain what happened to the national church within what happened to all of mainline Protestantism in the United States over this last century or so. Because I really truly believe that the decline of the Episcopal Church is just an intensified iteration of what happened to most mainline denominations here, and even other denominations that we wouldn't consider to be mainline. What most people don't realize is that while being Southern Baptist, if I say Southern Baptist now, it brings to mind, very conservative people. In the 1970s, it was not so. In the 1970s, one of the first churches to applaud the arrival of Roe v. Wade was the Southern Baptist Convention. If you can imagine that, you can picture that in your mind. So things do change. So even denominations like the Southern Baptist Convention had been affected by what picture I'm going to lay out here. For me, the issue begins with the development of what they call higher critical biblical and theological scholarship in the middle to late portion of the 19th century, particularly in the German academies. This methodology spread from the continent to Britain and then on to the elite theological and divinity schools like Princeton, Yale, and Harvard. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with higher critical scholarship, but the way that it developed became very antithetical to the gospel. It became antithetical to faith itself. Essentially, this approach says that you cannot believe in the content of the Scriptures and actually engage in genuine scholarly study of them. In other words, disbelief in the Bible became the prerequisite for actually being an academic student of the Bible. In order to study it, you had to not believe it. That's how things worked out. And it was a slow process. It wasn't immediate. The first folks who came up with the higher critical method were just trying to apply the scientific method in every field of study. They had pure motives. So here's kind of how it unfolded. Elite students from within the Episcopal Church and every other denomination in the United States would go to the best schools in the United States and the United Kingdom for their degrees, where they would be indoctrinated in this world of faithless critical scholarship. And upon finishing their degrees, these newly minted doctors would be hired to then teach in denominational seminaries. So you had your upper tier universities, your elite universities. Then underneath that, you had your actual denominational schools that trained students to be ministers in churches, in parishes. And so, you had General Seminary, Virginia Seminary, Seabury Western. You had all of these kind of seminaries. And for Presbyterians, you had Princeton, you had Yale. You had places like that where you could go and be trained. So these folks take up these teaching posts in these schools, and they further teach this higher critical method. And this is, again, happening across the board. They make sure the next generation of leaders in the denomination share their views. It's pretty easy to see where this is headed, right? Within a few generations, what you have is the majority of your priests, deacons, pastors, or whatever, trained to have zero confidence in the gospel, zero confidence in the Scriptures, and even little to no confidence in Christ Himself. This is why you will talk to someone as learned and faith-filled as Bishop Allison, and he will tell you that when he was in seminary, he took 2 courses on Bible. One on the synoptic problem, and one on how to divide Genesis into several different sources. Those were his 2 Bible courses that he was required to take. The rest of the time he was taking pop psychology, leadership, groupthink, things like that. So this is what he was doing. Now, thankfully, Bishop Allison realized that was not good for him and went on to, study the Scriptures, and we've all benefited greatly from his work. And but he'll tell you that story if you ask him what life was like for him in seminary. And that was really not that long ago. Now, I must stop here and say that not all the teachings of the higher critical method are bad. We've all been beneficiaries of the vast increase in the study of the ancient world. That's kind of the byproduct of that methodology. There's even ways to study from this perspective and remain faithful. But I'm sorry, that approach did not win the day amongst the main scholars. That's just not the way it is. I mean, even today at Duke, you have a divinity school that is post-liberal, but still very solidly, believes the Scriptures, believes in the divinity of Christ, and then you have a religion department that doesn't. And these 2 things have to live in this same space and see what's going on. And it was very much the same experience I had at the University of Edinburgh. You could either be a radical and take people who didn't believe the Scriptures at all, or you could be a good, thoroughgoing Christian and take folks who did believe the Scriptures, but they all kind of coexisted in one house. But the folks that were Orthodox were the minority. And that's just kind of the way things are in higher education. And some places are just intolerant towards Orthodox believers in operating in the academic sphere. So, if you go to Yale, Harvard, Princeton today, you're going to find yourself in a difficult place. You can go to Duke, you can go to Notre Dame, and you can find those threads of orthodoxy, but it's getting harder and harder to find. And there were efforts to counteract this trend. So you think about the history of the Episcopal Church. You had the establishment of Trinity School for Ministry. It used to be Trinity Episcopal School for Ministry. It was raised up for the whole reason of having a place where you could send evangelical Anglicans or evangelical Episcopalians to go and learn to be ministers in the church. That's what it was there for. Now, the reason I think that the history of the Episcopal Church is a little different than some of the other denominations is the fact that the nature of the church itself kind of created a perfect storm, because the elite clergy who had gone to these elite schools around the world, they rose to the ranks and become bishops. They rise to the office of the episcopacy. And from there, they can further spread these teachings and this methodology, because then you see the bishops in charge of where the ordinands in his diocese go to seminary. I mean, it's the same thing to today. I mean, in this diocese, more than likely, you're going to go to Trinity or to Nashotah. Those are your 2 options, 2 very places where you can go and be trained in Orthodox Anglicanism. That's going to be your options. For other folks, it wasn't that way. Some of you folks know Bishop Terrell Glenn. He tried very hard to go to Trinity. Was not allowed to. Had to go to Virginia Seminary. Same thing for Quig Lawrence from Roanoke. Some of you guys may know him as well. And the story is just repeated again and again. Folks are sent places they don't want to go by their bishop. And this is exactly how you end up with a man like, John Shelby Spong, who rejects every major tenet of the Christian faith, still somehow cloaked in a purple shirt, telling somewhere else where they should go to study the Scriptures. These are the folks that are leading the church, choosing the people to serve on the various boards within the denomination. So their control was vast, and it was pretty tight. So, and due to the church's structure, there's little to no chance of actually producing change from within. Many dioceses stayed in as long as possible, keeping a faithful witness in the church, South Carolina lasting the longest. Soon, however, the change in faith led to a change in order. As the revisionist camp gained more and more strength, they made institutional and canonical changes that ensured that they would remain in power and in control. Canon lawyers colluded with sitting political folks and fashioned the now infamous Dennis Canon, which has been the linchpin of text litigation for a decade. So they were active, and they were working for this institutional change that would ensure they stayed in power. And I think ultimately the final straw for South Carolina was the revision of Title IV for the canons on how to discipline clergy. It seems like all these changes were made just to isolate and inhibit Bishop Lawrence. And that kind of set in motion things to where we are today. So now we find ourselves as a church and as a diocese exploring how to be Anglican in this new landscape, in this new world. Like I said before, the renewal and expansion of Anglicanism in the United States is a story that is conterminous with the decline of the Episcopal Church. But within the TEC, there were many faithful people and faithful clergy. Around 20 years ago, efforts began to emerge to pull together faithful Episcopalians for worship and renewal. You guys may remember words like First Promise, Common Cause, Partnership. And these efforts did slow an exodus from the Episcopal Church. But the main church continued to abandon and redefine both faith and order. And all these efforts ultimately could not stop the tide. The consecration of Eugene Robinson was for many people the final straw, and all these efforts for renewal within kind of gave way to the formation of the Anglican mission in the Americas. I realize that for people who have spent the entire church life in this diocese, especially deep here in South Carolina, look back on the formation of EMEA with mixed feelings, and understandably so. There was a real sense of abandonment, a real sense of rejection, and this shouldn't be overlooked or ignored. There are real scars there and real feelings that need to be addressed. Yet this did mark a new attempt at being Anglican in the United States, apart from the Episcopal Church, but yet somehow still united with the worldwide Anglican Communion. And numbers of churches and clergy across the United States left the Episcopal Church and operated within the mission for many years. As time went on, more dioceses left tech intact. San Joaquin, Fort Worth, other dioceses eventually left in whole and began to seek oversight from other archbishops within the Anglican Communion. So you had folks that were getting coverage from Southern Cone, from Uganda, from Rwanda, from Nigeria, from all the parts of the world, Southeast Asia. All of this reshuffling of the cards on the deck finally led to the first Global Anglican Futures Conference being called in Jerusalem in 2008. Lots of things came out of this meeting, including the Jerusalem Declaration, which the diocese signed on to support last year by formal resolution. But the clear will of the 8 primates that were there, representing 80% of the Anglican Communion, was the establishment of a new province in North America. And in reaction to this declaration, the Anglican Church in North America was formed in Bedford, Texas in 2009. Bob Duncan served as its first archbishop. And this was made up from the diocese that had left the Episcopal Church and the Reformed Episcopal Church, which had left the Episcopal Church over 110 years ago. And the churches of EMEA were supposed to be part of that. But Chuck Murphy pulled back at the last second. And as you know, EMEA went on within the next 2 years after that decision was made to absolutely implode. And now over 80% of its former churches and clergy belong to the Anglican Church in North America in some form or fashion. This is where we are, my friends. This is how we've gotten to this place, this new world, this new expansion. And an expansion it is. And there's hope for even further expansion. Thankfully, the new Anglican movement knew immediately that the time was ripe for missionary endeavor, a missionary effort, a missionary church. So church planting became the heartbeat and central tenet of the ACNA. In the first 5 years of its existence, the ACNA launched over 500 new churches. And the province remains poised for continued growth through new diocesan planting initiatives. We had Bishop Wood here. Bishop Wood's got an organization within his diocese called Cardia that's all about planting churches, and its director, the Canon Winfield Bevins, has done such a good job there that he's actually been asked to come to Asbury Seminary and head up their whole church planting initiative nationwide there. So there's really something happening amongst Anglicans in the United States when it comes to church planting. We've hit a stride. We've found a live vein, so to speak, that we've tapped into, and God really has been at work. The question remains, why is this new period of growth and expansion continuing to happen? Episcopal Church has been losing membership for years, currently at the clip of over 2% per year. But it's not like these folks are leaving, established Episcopal churches and going to ACNA churches. That kind of growth stopped a long time ago. The first 3 years of the ACNA in EMEA was like that. But after that, it really came to a screeching halt. Something else must be at work here in this new period of growth for Anglicanism in North America. I really think that there are lots of reasons for this new growth, and the most important one that we should never overlook simply seems to be that God, through His Holy Spirit, is bringing folks into Anglicanism. There's no other really good explanation for it. Now, there are other more measurable reasons that we can look at. If you can think back with me and imagine, the first clergy to come into the Anglican mission and later the ACNA were all mostly former TEC clergy. But just like the transfer of membership, this flow of leadership stopped after first few years as well. The whole time that I was working as the bishop's canon, I didn't have a single person transfer like that over. It just wasn't like that. It just kind of got closed off. Everybody that wanted to come came, and then that was it. The next big wave was, and continues to be, the transfer of clergy from other traditions, much like myself. Apparently there were many closet Anglicans in the United States. I don't really know where they all came from. Mostly from studying abroad in the United Kingdom, I think. These people who had found their way into a prayer book spirituality somehow discovered Anglicanism through church history. And these are key leaders in the evangelical world. Just this last year, Bruce Waltke, who's 80-something years old, but still is a well-respected Old Testament scholar. In fact, he was Bishop Breedlove's professor at Dallas Seminary, became an Anglican deacon. Is on his way to becoming a priest. And, perhaps even more significant of that, Scott McKnight, who's written a lot of New Testament commentaries and is a big New Testament professor in Chicago, just this year became an Anglican deacon and will be a priest within a year as well. So this kind of stuff is happening all the time. Apparently these folks had Anglican leanings all along, but they could not join the Episcopal Church for theological reasons. But the new Anglican movement gave them an opportunity to live into the convictions that they had all along. This is continuing to happen amongst evangelicals everywhere because they simply keep reading their way into Anglicanism. This is essentially my story. It also happened to a number of my friends at the same time and some after me. To this day, at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, my name and my friend Keith Huffman, our names kind of live on in infamy, as they're like, it's become kind of a curse. So you're just like Father Keith and Father Donnie. So it just kind of continues to go on there. And I think it's primarily the work of two individuals that are really kind of drawing people into this. N.T. Tom Wright, who was the one-time Bishop of Durham, England, is now Professor of New Testament and Early Christian History at the University of St. Andrews. Has written, I think, 75 or 80 books, a untold plethora of scholarly articles, and is probably one of the foremost New Testament professors and scholars of early Christian history alive today. He's got a major role to play in this. I didn't bring his academic works in here, but you can come by my office and see that his ever-impressive book he just published this year on Paul, called Paul and the Faithfulness of God, is 1,750 pages. So he produces that kind of work for academics. So now it's impossible in the United States and any part of the English-speaking world to get an advanced degree in theology and not interact with Bishop Wright's work. You're going to work through it. And he's winsome, and he's a great writer. And he doesn't lead with his Anglicanism, but you can clearly see with his emphasis on the Eucharist and emphasis on baptism and prayer and just what God is doing in the world, he's kind of slowly but surely inviting people into the story that shaped and formed him. And then he turns and takes his large academic works and distills them into works like these you can pick up and read. These are like C.S. Lewis's work. This is simply Christian. This is mere Christianity for the 21st century. And he writes lots of works like this that kind of just distill his thought down to ways that just anybody sitting in any pew anywhere can pick up and understand. And so he's got this major role he's playing in people's lives like that. Now, the other guy, it's funny because the next guy is not even an Anglican. He's not even in a liturgical church at all. He doesn't grow up in that tradition whatsoever. In fact, he's kind of a weird mix of charismatic and Calvinistic thought. He teaches at Calvin College. His name's James K.A. Smith. And these are the first 2 volumes. The 3rd volume is pending. But these are all, you'll see the subtitle says Cultural Liturgies Volume 1 and Cultural Liturgies Volume 2. And this one's called Desiring the Kingdom. And this one's called Imagining the Kingdom. Smith is probably actually playing a bigger role in the attraction to liturgical churches in the United States than even Tom Wright is playing right now. These books explain how liturgy is at work all around us. It's not just something we do on Sunday morning, but all of our rituals and all of our routines of daily life are actually a form of liturgy. And then he demonstrates how the Christian liturgy that we engage in on Sunday is actually a way that we can form and shape ourselves so that we don't give way to the pressures and stresses of the secular liturgies that are operating all around us. And so these 2 men are having an untold influence on evangelicals who are studying in seminary in the United States today. I can assure you, we if I were to let you see my copy, we read through this in a reading group that we were having on seminary, and it's you just need to take it and look at it and see how much I've marked it up and how much we worked on it together. Now, in addition to these 2 authors drawing folks into liturgical renewal, there's also the emphasis on church planting really speaks to the younger generation of potential church leaders as well. People that are into planting churches are by default missional people. They know that church plants are more evangelistic and more missional than established churches just because they have to be in order to survive. These folks have a high capacity for risk. They're willing to shepherd small congregations until they can try to make it work. You know, they're bivocational. They are, adapting to circumstances. So you will find churches within Renewal Anglicanism meeting in a storefront, meeting at a YMCA, sharing space with another church, meeting at non-traditional times. In Prayer USA, we have 3 churches that are inside 2 that are in the District of Columbia, 1 that is just outside there. Let's see, he's gonna. I can't think of the name of the town. Somebody from Virginia, tell me that. Thank you. Yeah, so one of the first initial burgs outside of D.C. And so we've got 3 churches there that are all meeting at non-traditional times. They're meeting at 5 o'clock in the afternoon on Sunday. But yet all of them are full, 300 and 400 people at these churches. And then when they get together for the Easter Vigil each year, they all do it together. And there'll be sometimes 800, 1,000, 1,200 people there, and they're all 30 and younger. So it's kind of this unique situation where folks are being drawn into this at an alarming rate, and these churches are all less than 10 years old, and it's been an amazing thing to see what's going on. You'll find amongst the Renewal Anglican churches a commitment to the basic structure of an Anglican service. So if you went to one of these churches, you'd be like, okay, I recognize what we're doing. It may not be exactly the same, but the structure would be the same. The underlying parts of the service would be there. It'd be very different in terms of musical style. There is a church within Renewal Anglicanism in and around in Tennessee. I can't remember exactly where it is, but I know that if you go there, they sing the liturgy, but it's bluegrass. But it's very fitting to where they are. And it's a contextualization, you know. Not only for where they are, but all these little hipster kids that are hanging around there and drinking expensive coffee, they like that too. It somehow makes them feel better about themselves. And so, you'll just find stuff like that. Music, style, dress, formality, all this kind of stuff you will find to be open and to address very differently. But I also want to say that Renewal Anglicanism is also enjoying the byproduct of living at this point in history. And this is something we shouldn't overlook. Generation X and the millennial generation are the first adult generations to grow up in the muck and mire of postmodernity. They're kind of filled with this existential angst. They don't know anything. I mean, they can't figure out. They're just angst-ridden constantly. And I can say that because technically I belong to this group, but I had older parents. And so I have much more in common, I think, with the generation before me than the generation to which I actually belong as far as my little stamp goes. I'm not angst-ridden. I'm pretty sure what I know and pretty sure of what I believe, but lots of people my age don't, and they don't know what to do. And they want something. They're hungry. They're hungry for something ancient. They're hungry for something meaningful. They're hungry for something authoritative. They long to belong to something that's older than modernity and postmodernity. They want to be able to look past the rise of the scientific method and say, yes, I finally belong to something that's older than that. I don't have to worry about all the problems that it created and all the issues that are there. And this is why you find so many young people flocking to Anglicanism, but not only Anglicanism, traditional Catholicism. So folks who are interested in the Latin Mass, there's a little phrase out now that they want to be rad trad, which means they want to be radically traditional. And so you've got the masses filling up with young people, who are like this, and that's what they want to be. And then lastly, you've even got a major influx and expansion of orthodoxy, of Eastern Orthodoxy, and folks going into that, mainly just because they all want to belong to something that's old and authoritative and can give them some structure in their lives. And frankly, Renewal Anglicanism has understood that and has taken advantage of it and has reached out and tried to get to those folks. And that's why you'll find these kind of Renewal Anglican churches near college campuses and near larger cities where these folks are going to be. And they intentionally try to draw them out. They bring speakers like Jamie Smith and like Tom Wright in to see them. And I'll encourage you guys, the diocese has its Mere Anglicanism event in January. I believe it's the 23rd to 25th. Tom Wright will be one of the speakers there at the diocesan event, and it's in Charleston, and it's still got some slots open if you want to go. It's a great trip. And you'll see firsthand just kind of how winsome he is and how he drags people in. Now, the bigger question for us is, South Carolina, the Diocese of South Carolina, has found itself now having to ask all these questions about Renewal Anglicanism and about Anglicanism in North America, and what role, irregardless of what decision is made regarding the ACNA, are we going to play? And that's a key question for us to think about. I think there are several answers that we have to just wait on. One, we're going to have to wait and see how our legal situation plays out before we even think about moving forward. I think it would be unwise to expend a lot of energy and time in any one direction before the legal issues are even settled. If we get that settled, then we can begin to think about moving on. I'm not saying don't do the work now and think about it. I'm just saying don't expend a lot of energy and don't go around saying we're going to do this because we don't know exactly what may or may not happen. Two, we've got to patiently wait for the diocese to discern the will of God for our future provincial home. No matter what happens, we're going to be a part of Anglicanism in North America. Whichever way. There's no getting around it. We're going to be a part of it. Just how? So even if the diocese decides not to go into the ACNA, they're still going to be partners in ministry with the ACNA. So it's not going to be one of those situations of antagonism or anything like that. We're going to be part of this story. In fact, we already are. You can't turn back the clock. The genie is out of the bottle. Now, the bishop has said multiple times that one of his goals is to have a faithful expression of Anglicanism in every borough and burg in South Carolina. And I think that's a fantastic goal to have and a great start. Once the legal situation is resolved, I believe that expansion into other regions in this state are actually inevitable. I think that's inescapable. There are people already, before I ever came to the Diocese of South Carolina, I already heard rumbles of folks that are waiting for things to happen so that they can then move and seek out the diocese. So I think that's going to happen. It's just going to be something. The diocese will then expand and actually be the diocese of all of South Carolina. Furthermore, the diocese is in a healthy financial situation and can afford to support multiple church planting efforts. Now look, with any expansion, there's always difficulties to address. Like, South Carolina before hasn't had to think about what is it going to be like to now attract clergy from other denominations who now want to transfer and become part of you. Just never had to ask that question. And there's no particular procedure in place right now of how to deal with folks who are coming from that kind of setup. And so that's something we'll have to address. And then next generation leadership development, how to raise up new leaders for these new Anglican works. Like Bishop Lawrence says, missional Anglicans for a global age. How are we going to identify them? How are we going to train them? How are we going to make sure they have what they need to lead the next generation? So some of our processes will have to be revamped to address a missionary age. But we have a fantastic opportunity for gospel growth. And I hope that we can put this kind of page behind us soon and just follow God into what He's doing in Renewal Anglicanism in North America. Thank you.